Welcome to Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. This week, we cover two very different stories about the travails of the young. In the second half of our show, Jared Meyer from the Acton Institute discusses the new book he co-authored with Diana Furchtgott-Roth titled Disinherited: How Washington is Betraying America's Young. Up first, Elise Hilton from the Acton Institute takes us inside the dark world of human trafficking, revealed in her new book, A Vulnerable World. Elise, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Bill. I appreciate having the opportunity to speak to you and speak to your audience.
You know, Elise, I finished your book a couple of days ago. It's probably one of the most horrifying things I've read in a long time. How is it possible that in today's world, 21 million people live in a virtual state of slavery?
That is an excellent question, and it's got many layers to it. First of all, slavery exists today because it's hidden. People don't know about it. They don't know that there are 21 million people today, at least, that are living in slavery. I think the next part of that very complex question is greed. It's very easy to make a lot of money buying and selling human beings. And I also think that the final part of that, because sex trafficking is such a huge part of human slavery today, is just unbridled lust. It's not very hip to talk about things like greed and lust because they're very old-fashioned terms, but that's what human slavery is about. That's what it boils down to.
Well, let's break this down in steps. And of course, greed and lust have been with us as long as we've been humans. What's the going price right now globally to buy another human being?
Shockingly, you probably have enough money in your wallet, or you've spent enough money in the past couple of days to buy a person. $90 is about the going rate today to buy a human being.
Unbelievable.
And I think if most of us, pause and think about what we've spent over the last couple of days filling our gas tank, buying a meal, stopping at the grocery store, we've spent enough to buy a human being. And that's a really shocking figure to think that a human life is
so cheap.
$90.
How big a business is human trafficking altogether globally in dollar terms?
Human trafficking is huge. We know that it's at least a $32 billion a year industry.
A year?
Yes, it's probably more. And the only thing that exceeds it in terms of illegal activity is drugs. And most people that study human trafficking think that trafficking is going to surpass the drug trade within the next couple of years. And there's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, when you sell drugs, you sell it, and then you don't have any more. You either have to buy more or produce more. When you're selling a human being, especially in sex trafficking, you can sell that human being over and over and over again. For example, your $90 investment, if you're a sex trafficker, will yield you somewhere between $27,000 and $30,000 a year for that one person.
Wow.
That's a pretty good investment if you're a trafficker.
How much of human trafficking is connected to the sex trade, and how much is connected with labor or domestic servitude?
As much as sex trafficking gets media attention, and most people have seen things like the movie Taken, or they've seen an episode of SVU that involves sex trafficking, labor trafficking is actually a much larger problem globally. It tends to involve construction industries, it tends to involve factory work, and it tends to involve agricultural work. So those are the three big areas for labor trafficking. And I'm not talking about places in India necessarily where people are making bricks. I'm talking about here in the United States. It's everywhere. I tell people constantly, wherever you are, there is human trafficking.
How does labor trafficking different from classic indentured servitude, which is how many poor immigrants historically came to America?
In some ways, it's very similar. But what often drives labor trafficking, especially in the United States, is classically a middle-aged man or an older man who's got a family to support and is living in a situation where there's no way for him to make a living, sheer poverty. oftentimes what they'll do is fall prey to someone who says, hey, I can get you a job in the United States. It pays really well. I'll get you a visa. I'll take care of you. Once you get there, we can start working on citizenship. And in fact, traffickers do get visas for these people.
So these are legal immigrants?
Yes. But then what happens is once they get here, all of their paperwork, all of their identification is taken away from them. So they have no way to prove that they're here on a visa. They have no way to prove who they are. They often do not know where they are, and they often don't speak the language. And then they're told very often, okay, now you have to pay off the debt that you owe me for getting you here, and then you'll start earning money. And of course, that never happens.
Classically, if you look at the economics of slavery versus the economics of poverty, they don't always work out in favor of the slaveholder. I mean, a poor person works extremely hard trying to make a living, puts in all the extra hours, all the extra effort, and takes his own risk, whereas a slave owner has to feed his slaves and doesn't necessarily get the hardest work out of them. How does this math all balance out?
Well, classically, most of us are familiar with the slave era in American history. A slave owner did want to take care of his property, just in the same way that a person who has cattle or horses on a farm wants to take care of them because they're his livelihood. So slaves in the United States, although I am not saying that they were well taken care of, were fed, were clothed, and they were kept in good working condition.
Out of economic motivations.
Right. There was an economic motivation because you counted on them as a slave owner to help make your farm successful economically. If you're a trafficker, you can bring people into the United States and sell them to someone else, dump them. They become somebody else's responsibility. And that person really is not all that motivated to take care of them because, frankly, there's a whole lot of other people that are readily available. The thing about trafficking today is that life is very cheap. You can buy a person for $90, and if something happens to them,
you get a new one.
There's another person right behind them that's willing to take that place.
The British Navy put an end to the international slave trade back in the 1800s, which really was a historically unprecedented move, seeing that slavery goes back over 8,000 years. What is law enforcement doing now, both in the U.S. and internationally, to stop this?
Law enforcement is literally running behind human traffickers, trying to keep up with them. And in many cases, the laws have not kept up with traffickers. Let me give you an example. Here in the state of Michigan, where I am working at the Acton Institute, in Michigan, it literally just became law this year to make it illegal to solicit a minor for sex. Before that, it was not illegal to solicit a minor for sex.
Well, we'll get to that. That's the sex trade, which is another big, dark part of this. But I'm talking just on the labor side.
Well, again, the international and the national law enforcement is trying to catch up with this. First of all, there's just not enough people. I live in an area where we have a lot of agriculture. There's a lot of migrant workers. There are state overseers to make sure that the migrant workers are paid, they're well cared for, they have places to live that are decent housing, but they're stretched thin. If a farm were to get one visit a year from these folks, that would be a lot. So the ability for somebody to go in and see the difference between a legitimate migrant worker and someone who may be trafficked, it's very difficult.
Would a wide open and well-regulated Bracero program help eliminate this?
It's hard to say. I think one of the things that instead of saying we need more government intervention, I think one of the things that we need to do is make people more aware of trafficking. I think even sometimes those who are hiring migrant workers are not aware of the differences between somebody who's a legitimate migrant worker and somebody who may be trafficked. Seeing the signs, knowing the people that they're working with, all of these things would help diminish human trafficking. You and I both know that there are a lot of unscrupulous people out there in all industries. So a guy that is in the construction business that's looking to cut corners on costs, he doesn't care where his workers come from. Would government regulation help with that? Maybe, maybe not.
So, Elise, you indicated earlier that sex trafficking was a big part of the human slavery movement. How does sex slavery differ from adults who go into the prostitution business by choice? I mean, maybe a bad choice, but nonetheless a personal decision and not a kidnapping.
Well, I would say that there aren't too many people that choose prostitution by choice. Many of them are forced into it via addictions or lack of education. I don't know too many people that would want to have sex with strangers, 20 or 30 a night, knowing that at least one of them is going to physically assault you, which is the statistics for most prostitutes. However, the average sex trafficking victim in the United States is a teenage girl, and most of them have been lured by traffickers because they're in very unstable home situations. They either have parents that are not around, there's abuse issues at home, there are drug and alcohol issues in the home or with the child themselves. They may be runaways or what we call throwaways, kids who have had their parents say to them, I don't want to deal with you anymore, get out of my house. These kids are really, really vulnerable to sex traffickers.
Prostitution is legal in Holland and even parts of Nevada. Could legalizing and regulating prostitution be used to help stamp out the horrors of illegal sex trafficking?
I don't think so. And I myself don't advocate the legalization of prostitution because, frankly, I think even because it's legal doesn't make it right. You're still using another human being for your own pleasure. To me, it's the same as legalizing slavery. It doesn't make it right.
Well, I certainly understand your moral perspective. I just wonder if many of the sex workers in places where it's legal, like Holland, where they've formed unions and have health care, would agree. They certainly look like they're in their business by choice.
That may be the case, but I also know that there are places in Sweden, for example, where they've ramped up their laws against sex trafficking. Prostitution has become illegal, and they have really done great work in helping to eliminate that type of trafficking, and I think that's much more promising. And I also think that by legalizing prostitution, this to me is a really important point. Fighting sex trafficking right now anywhere in the world is very, very difficult because oftentimes the men and women, boys and girls who are caught in sex trafficking are treated as criminals. And they're often told, and I have this in my own experience, that they chose to do this. So it's their own fault that they got beat up. It's their own fault that they got into this situation. And I think that by legalizing prostitution, we run the risk of having those people just fall through the cracks again. Hey, it's legal, so whatever happens to them happens to them.
Much of the sex trade takes place in developing countries in the third world, places like Thailand. Some of your most awful horror stories involve stories of parents selling their own children.
Yeah.
What kind of moral universe do these people live in that would cause them to make such a choice?
I think it's a moral universe, first of all, where life has very little value, especially the life of females. Many of these, especially in the Asian world, females are very devalued. We see the highest abortion rates for girls in those countries. Many places in Asia, if a female girl is born, she's killed. Infanticide is a common practice in many places. So a family selling a female child into sex trafficking isn't that big of a deal to them because a female is seen as a burden financially. But we also have to look at the economic aspects of this. If people had a way to support themselves and their families in a wholesome, healthy way, this would never happen. We have to look at how do we develop these countries economically and give people economic opportunities so that this never happens.
You raise an important issue, which we address regularly on this program, a little bit outside the scope of today's conversation. Let me swing it back around to law enforcement. Several years ago, President Obama launched an initiative to combat human trafficking, both in the U.S. and overseas. What became of that?
Some of the states here in the United States have been working diligently to update their laws regarding trafficking, both labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And at the international level, national and international level, there's been good progress, I think, solid progress in working with other law enforcement agencies at the federal level and at the international level. Unfortunately, a lot of local law enforcement agencies are still very poorly trained in terms of sex trafficking, labor trafficking, in terms of recognizing it, in terms of how to deal with the victims, in terms of helping those victims find services that they need. So we're still playing catch up in a lot of places.
Reading up on this, I understand that Obama at first praised the efforts of faith-based groups such as yours to fight trafficking, but then cut off funds. What happened there?
Yes. Well, President Obama's administration did not want to fund any programs that did not include birth control and abortion services for human trafficking victims. So that meant that most faith-based and especially Catholic organizations lost huge amounts of funding. For example, the United States Catholic Bishops is one of the largest human trafficking survivor programs in the United States. They lost more than half their funds, which meant that in many places, all services were lost for human trafficking survivors. And they were services that many trafficking survivors did not want and did not need. But President Obama's administration decided that if an organization was going to offer services to human trafficking victims, they also had to include birth control and abortion services.
So, Elise, you've become a very passionate activist in this area, both as a moral crusade and an economic crusade. How did you get involved in this?
I don't think anybody sets out to become an expert in human trafficking. I certainly did not. But for me, it has become a very personal and passionate crusade because I have a daughter who was a victim of sex trafficking. And I think one of the reasons that my family story is so important is that it drives home the point that wherever you are and whoever you are, trafficking can touch you.
What happened?
Well, my daughter, who is now 19, was 16 at the time. And it's important to know that she suffers from bipolar disorder and she's cognitively impaired. So she functions at about the level of a third grader. She was at her school. It was January 3 years ago. And she got in trouble at school. She got angry and she was allowed to leave the school. She walked about 4 blocks and she disappeared. We literally had no idea where she was. We were frantic, as you can only imagine. We were calling the police. We were driving up and down streets in our city day and night. We had no idea where she was. She just simply disappeared. About 48 hours after that, I got a phone call from the police telling me that they had her. She'd been recovered, and I went to her. She was in the local hospital, and she had been absolutely brutalized. We found out later that what had happened is when she walked down the street from her school, a man approached her and said, you're too pretty to be outside on this cold day. You don't have a coat. You don't have anything. Come inside and get warm. And as I said, she functions at about the level of a 9-year-old. So she went into this house with a man she did not know. She was given alcohol, and she was raped repeatedly. He then passed her on to a couple of other men. She was eventually taken to a house where there were other young girls, teenage girls.
Good Lord.
They had all their clothing removed, taken away from them. They had their photographs taken, we assume for sale on the internet, and then they were locked in.
And where was this?
It was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. You know, the bright shining star of West Michigan. We do not live in Southside Chicago. We do not live in inner city Los Angeles. We live in Grand Rapids, Michigan.
How'd she get away?
Well, you know, my daughter, despite her disabilities, is one incredibly brave young woman. She waited until one of the men fell asleep, and she stole the key out of his pocket and grabbed the sheet off of her bed, and she ran. She ended up hiding in an abandoned building, and a man found her. We think it was probably a homeless person, and he gave her his coat, and he went and found one of the social workers that works on the streets with the homeless folks, and that's how we recovered her. It was absolutely devastating. She was traumatized almost beyond belief. We eventually had to have her hospitalized for about 4.5 months.
Oh, boy.
I'm happy to say that she has recovered very well.
Good.
She is doing great. She goes to school. She volunteers at our church. She is just a lovely, joyful young woman. But she is the reason that I do all of what I do in terms of getting the word out on human trafficking. I don't want any girl, any parent, anyone to go through what our family has gone through. It's preventable. We can stop this, but people need to know.
Well, Elise, we really appreciate you coming and sharing this with us and with our listeners. Good luck to you and to your program, and thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you so much, Bill. I really appreciate the opportunity.
That was Elise Hilton from the Acton Institute here on Real Clear Radio Hour, brought to you by the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I'm your host, Bill Frezza. Please check out Real Clear Radio on Facebook or follow us on Twitter at Real Clear Frezza. And stop by RealClearMarkets.com, my go-to place for diverse views on political economics. Real Clear Radio Hour is a not-for-profit, donor-supported program. Please stop by RealClearRadio.org and hit the donate button or contact us to become a corporate supporter. Ahead, Jared Meyer from the Manhattan Institute explains why millennials may be the first generation of Americans to enjoy less economic prosperity than their parents. Stay tuned.